Hi there, everybody. Welcome back to Insomnia. I'm your host, Adrian Ladalia, and let's get right into it. I was just doing some light reading here, an old book on astronomy. Astronomy is, as you know, the branch of science which studies space, celestial objects, and the universe as we know it, and it can be traced all the way back to ancient times. Indeed, in antiquity, most of the cosmos were attributed to divinity or spiritual properties, and therefore, most of the astronomical observations were made by priests or clerical figures. Some of the most notable contributions to the field were made by the Babylonians of Mesopotamia via star catalogs they had made in around 1200 BCE, which laid the foundation for the rest of the world to follow with their own developments. We as a species have always had a profound fascination with the stars at night, with many cultures assigning epic tales and symbolism to the shimmering lights above, and many had dreamed that one day we may even be able to reach them. But who would have imagined back then that we would eventually reach that technologic capability, and who could have imagined how in order to reach that destination, many lives would be lost? Today we talk about the Lost Cosmonauts. Did the Soviet Union really launch several humans into space with no way of them returning? Well, let's take a look at what we know for sure. Before we really look at the topic at hand, we need to first take a look at the history of where it all supposedly had taken place. Soviet Russia. Russia is by landmass alone the largest nation in the world, and the ninth most populated, with the first being China. While the country has had a vast history, for the sake of brevity, we'll be focusing on specifically how the Soviet Union came into place. Most are familiar with the monarchy established in Russia, or the Tsardom in 1547, which was an autocratic, centralized state, with the Tsar as a king of sorts, or supreme ruler. It lasted till about 1721 when Peter the Great established the Russian Empire, one of the largest empires ever to have existed, second only to the British and Mongol empires. A notable figure of this time period was also Catherine II, or Catherine the Great, the longest ruling and successful female leader of the country. The empire had lasted all the way to February of 1917, when it was finally overthrown and replaced with a provisional government due to an economic crisis brought on by World War I, amongst other things. It didn't last long, as the following October, also known as Red October, brought about the Bolshevik Revolution, which would set the stage for communist Russia, with Vladimir Lenin playing a leading role. This prompted a civil war between the loosely allied White Army, those in favor of the previous ways of governance, and the Red Army. This lasted about 5 years, and then on December 30th, 1922, the Red Army was victorious, expanding and establishing the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or the USSR. After the end of World War II, the world had been divided. This prompted an age of political tension between the United States and the Soviet Union, which lasted from the end of the war in 1945 all the way to 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed. Thus, the age of the Cold War had begun, and while no actual fighting had broken out between the two superpowers, their differences were fought through proxy wars, wars where two sides didn't directly engage but rather funded other people to do it for them. Technological displays of dominance, arms stockpiling, and of course, information and espionage. This would lead to both nations setting their sights towards the stars and vowing to reach them before the other. The ultimate display of technological superiority, spaceflight, and its application towards spying on their enemies. On August 2nd, 1955, the United States announced that it would put an artificial satellite into space. The Russians immediately responded and began working on doing the same. It was a race to the heavens, with pride, ideologies, and national security at stake. The space race was in full swing. On October 4th, 1957, the Russians had launched Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite into Earth's orbit. The world was both amazed yet fearful, for the race had now fallen heavily into the East's favor. And then on November 3rd, 1957, the Soviets were able to launch another craft into space, only this time with a living occupant. The brave little soul Laika was the pilot, a stray dog from Moscow who would go on to become the first traveler of the cosmos. She never returned. The United States, in the face of defeat, immediately organized ARPA, or the Advanced Research Projects Agency, under the direct order of President Dwight D. Eisenhower. Its purpose was to boost our technological capabilities beyond that of our enemies, and then in 1958 the Explorer 1 satellite was launched. But it was a short-lived sense of relief. 3 years later, the Russians would up the ante, the likes of which were seemingly insurmountable. 1959 was the beginning of the Vostok program, the secret Soviet human spaceflight program. Its goal was to send humans into a low orbit and return them home safely. 200 experienced young pilots and military personnel were selected for the program, with only 20 making the next step of training, of which only 6 were selected for cosmonaut training. Known at the time as the Vanguard 6, the Vostok program was a success, and on April 12, 1961, they had launched the first man into space and changed the course of human history.
Yuri Alexeyevich Gagarin, a senior lieutenant of the Soviet Air Forces, was the chosen pilot of the Vostok 1 spacecraft, and he successfully completed an entire orbit of the Earth and returned home safely, where he was awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. He was 27 years old at the time.
America had responded quickly, and on May 5, 1961, they had launched a manned spacecraft as well. While it did not achieve orbit, it was the first craft to be manually controlled by the pilot, Alan Shepard, the first American in space. But that wasn't enough. Shortly after the launch, President John F. Kennedy boldly announced the goal of putting a man on the moon by the end of the decade.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other thing. Not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
And on July 20th, 1969, Apollo 11 landed 2 astronauts on the lunar surface. The space race was conclusively over, and the United States had prevailed. With every great movement in history comes sacrifice, and in this case, despite the monumental advancements of technology and strides forward, there were some major disasters along the way, many of which have been brushed aside or kept under wraps until only recently, and some are supposedly still kept secret to this day. In total, 13 confirmed deaths have resulted from various training exercises and accidents, and at least 18 have been confirmed during spaceflight. One of the most tragic examples which comes to mind for many is the Challenger disaster in January of 1986. 7 crew members all lost their lives as the shuttle broke apart 73 seconds after launch off the coast of Cape Canaveral, Florida. The Soviet Union was notorious for its heavy use of censorship and the concealment of information, so many of the deaths which did actually occur there had been kept hidden from the world, some of which were only discovered over 30 years after. Most notably were the following.
Valentin Bondarenko, age 24, burned to death in a pressure chamber during a routine exercise. Vladimir Komarov, aged 40, manually re-entered Earth's atmosphere, but his spacecraft's parachute failed to open upon re-entry. He hit the ground at high speed, killing him instantly. After the communications blackout, his voice was picked up on transmission, quote-unquote, crying out in rage, cursing the people who had put him in a faulty machine. The real tragedy is that he knew of the craft's technical faults and the chances of something going wrong, but insisted he be sent instead of his good friend Yuri Gagarin.
Soyuz 11 was an attempt to send 3 cosmonauts aboard the Salyut-1 space station, which was launched in June of 1971. The men had reached the station and remained on board for 22 days. Upon re-entry into the Earth's atmosphere, however, their craft had failed, and depressurization began due to a mechanical fault. The crew were immediately killed. They were discovered in the landed craft with their skin turned blue and blood running from their nose and eyes. And what's worst of all is the top-secret Nedelin catastrophe, which occurred on October 24, 1960. During the development of a new intercontinental ballistic missile, a rocket engine ignited directly into a massive supply of fuel, which resulted in a fiery explosion which ended up killing 165 technicians and staff almost instantly. One of the worst spaceflight disasters in history. It was covered up immediately and never spoken of until 1989. These would be tragic enough in their own right, however the story gets much darker. Several accounts all seem to detail vague but disturbing stories of nameless figures who simply vanished during the time period. Vladimir Shatilov, a former cosmonaut who became commander of cosmonaut training from 1971 to 1987, claimed to have mentioned to his new American counterparts that several trainee cosmonauts, between 6 to 8, all died during training or afterwards. Supposedly he could not remember most of the details. Another account is by Mikhail Rudenko, an engineer who worked on several space missions. He claimed that 3 men were shot straight up with no way back between 1957 and 1959. Many dispute this claim. Finally, Vladimir Ilyushin, a general and skilled pilot, was supposedly the first man in space, but the mission almost ended in disaster, so the Soviets kept the story under wraps, allowing Yuri Gagarin to be the publicly known, more successful story. So who were these mysterious cosmonauts, who all seemingly perished without a name? This brings us to the story of Italian brothers Achille and Giovanni Giudica Cordelia, 2 amateur ham radio operators and space enthusiasts who set up their own broadcast station in Turin during the early 1960s. Supposedly, they were able to intercept several secret transmissions from the Soviet space flights, and on November 28, 1960, the brothers picked up a Morse code transmission detailing an SOS message to the entire world. An observatory in West Germany at the time had also picked up this strange signal. It was concluded that, based on patterns observable, the signal was actually moving further and further from the Earth. Then, on December 1st of that year, the USSR announced it had launched a craft into space, but it was a failure. Strange coincidence, indeed.
February 2nd, 1961, the brothers claimed to have picked up the sounds of a quickened heartbeat and panicked breaths which slowly but surely ceased. Could it have been the sound of a dying cosmonaut? May 17th, 1961, 3 voices were picked up, 1 female and 2 male. They were quoted as sounding frightened, having said, "Conditions growing worse. Why don't you answer? We are going slower. The world will never know about us," before cutting out entirely. May 19th, 1961, a female voice in Russian is picked up, clearly in distress with much static in between.
Could these recordings be proof that several individuals met their untimely death in space? Well, many believe so, but it raises many questions. First and foremost, who were they? While many believe that due to the Soviet Union suppressing information, it was all covered up. Those skeptics have pointed out that most of the covert information that was hidden has all been revealed and accessible since the USSR collapsed. This doesn't necessarily mean, however, that the information wasn't destroyed. A big criticism of the theory is that a communications blackout occurs upon re-entry, rendering radio communication useless, so many believe some of these transmissions could not have been made during the purported times. Another major criticism made by skeptics of the theory are that none of the transmissions received seem to follow any standard military protocol, which seems incongruent with the requirements of actually being a cosmonaut at the time. Also, there seemingly aren't any female cosmonauts ever documented, which seems strange in and of itself. However, this once again all comes back to the idea that perhaps they were simply erased. So ultimately, we're left with a lot of questions that we may never actually have the answers to. But there is one thing that I would like to know, and that's what you guys think. I'm your host, Adrian Ladelia, and this is Insomnia.